Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claudia Rizzini, and I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program here at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first installment of our Summer 2025 series of Virtual Radcliffe Book Talks. This series explores recent publications whose subject or authors have a connection with the Radcliffe Institute. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Rahul Bhatia, who was the Lisa Goldberg Fellow at Radcliffe during academic year 2022-2023. At Radcliffe, we bring together scholars, artists, scientists, and public intellectuals to pursue curiosity-driven research and engage with pressing issues of our time. Our Book Talk series is one of the ways we share that work with the public. Now let me introduce our author for today's program. Rahul Bhatia is an independent journalist and author of today's featured work, The New India, the Unmaking of the World's Largest Democracy, which explores the rise of nationalism in India over the past decade and the country's subsequent political transformation. In addition to profiles of power brokers, issue of technology adoption, and themes of accountability and access in India, Rahul focuses on the experiences and views of ordinary people. Drawing on hundreds of interviews, personal letters, diary entries, and partition-era police reports, Rahul traces India's road to nationalism and its impact on its citizens. The book has been widely acclaimed. It was named Nonfiction Book of the Year at the Kerala Literary Festival and selected by both the New York Times and NPR as Book of the Year. Joining Rahul in conversation today is Christopher Muller, Professor of Sociology at Harvard and Schutzer Fellow in the 2022-2023 Radcliffe cohort, who researches the political economy of incarceration in the United States from Reconstruction to the present. The discussion will be followed by an audience Q&A. We encourage those watching on Zoom to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program, and the speaker will address as many as they can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short. This will enable Rahul and Chris to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. For today's program, we also gratefully acknowledge the Steiner Dean's Leadership Fund for Academic Ventures, which is supporting this event. Thank you all for being here. It is now my great pleasure to give the virtual floor to Rahul, who will offer a brief reading before engaging in conversation with Chris. Rahul, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claudia. This is about 5 minutes long, this little reading, and I'm going to read the start of The New India, a significant part of which I wrote at the Radcliffe. A decade or so ago, people I loved began to go mad. There was a man I adored, a relative, who was funny even when he stood still. He emerged from his bathroom every morning in a banyan and a towel, his large, smugglerish face coated in shaving lather. Sometimes he wore sunglasses while he shaved, an act that made his brothers chuckle and his wife groan. Never could a straight reply be extracted from him, not about lunch, or where his children were, or what time he would return from the shop, or where the keys to the scooter were. I watched his stamina for turning everything into comic material in awe and tried to match him, joke for joke, to establish our connection. So it was strange when he began to speak passionately about Muslims, arguing that they were less than human and that India had to become a Hindu nation to save itself. Muslims had been absent from his conversations before, but now they were everywhere. He had decided he was oppressed, that he had been in hiding with his thoughts, and nothing could shake his conviction. Now he was full of these dark notions whose paths led to danger, but he did not see it that way. The future, he imagined, burgeoned with opportunity, and there was this jaunty optimism in his bearing that I recognized as triumphalism. He had aligned himself with the fortunes of a political party as if it was a sports team, and his team was about to win the 2014 elections. Now, before or after his man won, I can't remember when, his smiley face jokes acquired a touch of arsenic. He sent me edited video clips and invented headlines that depicted the country in twisted ways I did not recognize at all. It was clear that secularism represented a past he wanted to break with, one that included generations of flawed and corrupting behavior, the traitorous behavior of liberals, and a compromised media. Not just politics, he wanted the nation state rebuilt. So he picked up disparaging words that had become acceptable by dint of their unthinking repetition, and he took pleasure in the discomfort they caused. Bristling at one, prostitute, I brought to his notice that the phrase and its implications included me, his nephew. I wondered if reminders of our bond would bring him back, but those were early days before it became clear that the condition was autoimmune. It was emerging from within. He made sure not to speak the word in my presence from then on, but there were other words ready to channel the feelings he had kept to himself. The vocabulary seemed to have one purpose: to strip people, ideas, and expectations of their language and join new meaning to them. And as he unveiled this unsettling lexicon in waves, it came to feel like a project of deconstruction. Week after week, as the extent of his transformation became clearer, I felt him pulling away from my memory of his previous self. It was not so much a descent into paranoia as much as his having found peace. Now, scenes like these played out in other families, with other sets of friends. Acquaintances reported in confusion that they too had lost family members, including their parents, to the condition. No one really knew what they believed in. Our elders had raised us with values that they had abandoned themselves. Something unseen was changing us. Reasonable people said worrying things about democracy and minorities and began to amplify the triumphant messages of the new Prime Minister Modi, his party. Trying to change their mind was pointless. For the Bharatiya Janata Party, to which Modi belonged, history was as much a priority as the present and future. It needed old injustices to remind its Hindu constituents of Muslim conquerors and the dangers they posed. That was where its power lay, in the narrative of eternal danger and vigilance. Our families heard these messages and made these concerns their own. Arguments would time travel, hopping back centuries until a suitable villain, usually a Muslim, was found. It weathered my defiance. The people I loved were emboldened to reveal this new side of themselves all at once, armed with facts plucked from here and there, which they thrust like daggers in a fog. They had become true believers. If it wasn't for these transformations, this book would probably not exist. There would be nothing to unravel, nothing to interpret. But a new kind of India was emerging, and the old norms of secularism and equality, however flawed their execution, were being cast off. This unfamiliar country had begun to justify even murder if the occasion demanded it. I did not understand this, and so I tried to. That is the beginning. I'd like to invite Chris to the floor, and we'll have this conversation, and he will, send forth your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rahul. It's a real pleasure to have the chance to discuss this extraordinary book. It's extremely important and absorbing, and you can get a sense of the quality of the writing from the passage that Rahul just read. So Rahul, the line that stood out to me from this passage is the following. You write, "Our elders had raised us with values they had abandoned themselves." So could you tell us, what are these values and how they change? The book is called The New India. So what is the new India and how does it differ from the old?
Chris, I grew up in a family that believed in secularism, in the separation of church and state, and treating people well, and being kind, and all those values that if you're lucky, you grew up with. And India, to some extent, I feel was like that. There was a certain idea of India. It was formed with this idea that it would be a place for everybody. It was this noble mansion under which all these people, these different people would live, whatever their ideologies, whatever their feelings, they all had space this under this big tent. And it meant that this country was headed in a certain direction towards an imperfect, but I think it was really trying to get better at it, this imperfect democracy where people had a voice, where you knew that your voice counted, not all the time, but that was the idea, where if you looked for a house or you went to the police, hopefully your religion would not come into the picture. But at the same time, while all of this was happening, and while I grew up with these ideals, and I know a lot of people grew up with these ideals, we really do see India as, at one level, a secular nation. Still, there were riots, and there was violence, and people were constantly reminded that India did not have a place for them. Now, I'm a Hindu and I'm sort of well-to-do. And so I'm from the privileged class. And so you don't always see it, the abrasive nature of life in India, where you're told, well, you're a Muslim, and so maybe you can't rent a house in that particular area. That always existed. But what happened was it was unsaid for a large part. People paid lip service to the idea of India as a secular nation. And I mean, even paying lip service to something, if the words are said, they mean something. But what happened was about 10 or 12 years ago, there was this idea that sprouted, that took root actually all over the place, of India as a muscular country, of a new kind of country that was going to assert itself on the world stage. That there was for too long we had been hiding, and all of this was coming from the same place. This was coming from this place of, it was intertwined with politics and right-wing Hindu nationalist politics, where they said, we're coming into governance with this idea that this is going to be a break from the past. You've been held back, but no more. And so here is the new India, which is looking forward, which is industrializing, where people will have a job, where you will be richer, where other countries will respect you and show you the kind of respect you haven't been shown before. Now, at the same time, what was going on? India, I think I would argue, just became a more violent place, and it became a more hostile place to people who didn't necessarily agree with the way things were going. I think if you stood up and said, well, I don't think we should stand up in cinemas when the national anthem is played, or I don't think the national anthem should be imposed upon us in cinemas, you would get beaten up. People would walk into your house and say, well, you have beef in your refrigerator, and they would lynch you, and then they would be garlanded. And you had other such things like this. You had the rise of cow vigilantes, these young jobless men who were told, go out there, stop trucks. If they're carrying cows, the people who are driving these trucks are fair game. So, and these men turned out to be Muslims, drivers and things like that. And many of them died, they were lynched. And so you had a country that was, some level, was normalizing force in the public sphere, in the public domain. And so when I saw all of this, when I saw my own family, my relatives, my friends talk about how Muslims were this way or that way, and they started saying things that they would have thought twice about, three times about before saying once upon a time. You know that these ideas had now gained a certain public acceptance. It was okay to come out and say them. And I know that other countries have been through this as well, where it's now suddenly people feel free to just come out and say what they've been hiding all along. And I think it comes from the same place. Just this deep desire that we've gone too far and now I'm going to have some fun. And there's also a bit of tweaking going on over here where let me own the libs, I guess, at some level. So you had a sense of that, a certain kind of thing happening in India as well. And so when I say the new India, it's really a play on this marketing slogan that the Prime Minister came in with, which was the new India. It means something. And that's why in India, when the book came out, we didn't call it the new India. We called it the Identity Project, because the new India was a right-wing slogan, which people now use to sort of describe a bunch of things in India. So that's what it is. It's a very personal thing, but you also see it all around you. It's kind of manifested in certain ways all around you. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So you said to me recently that for you, observing, what's happening in the United States today is like watching what you started to observe happening in India 10 to 12 years ago. So, what are some of the similarities and the differences that you perceived in what's happening across these two countries?
When I saw Project 2025, this document, this vision for what America could be, I called up my friends who are historians, and we laughed and said, this is something we've seen. This is just a document, but we've actually seen how these things play out. It means packing the courts with people who share your ideology. It means packing the justice system, the police, your district magistrates, and every position of power that exists, whether you see it as consequential or inconsequential. It can be something as simple as, the head of a cooperative bank, or something as simple as, the head of a club, a neighborhood club. You have people in these positions who are conservative in their ideology. You have books taken out of libraries. You have universities that really that won't invite speakers of a certain ideology, which is liberal in nature, critics of the government. You have reporters who can't find work anymore. And so when I talk to you about similarities, I'm looking at what America is going through at the moment, and I'm reminded so much of what my friends and we've been telling our American friends a lot, which is look to other countries, look to India in particular, and you'll have an idea of where this could go, the shape that control takes over here, the relationship between, or rather the way billionaires and the government or the heads of state interact with each other, the way favors are granted, the way money passes hand. These things are very, very familiar. There's a writer, James Crabtree, who actually did a piece, I think, for Foreign Policy, if I'm not mistaken, about how billionaires have been working with Trump lately. And we had a brief chat about it. It's quite familiar. So when you see, the head of a company saying, well, the president's wife would make for a great movie on my platform over here, I understand where that's coming from. We've seen that story play out in India. We've seen the rise of nationalistic cinema, which is not out and out nationalistic, but it has it has certain elements that are unmistakable. And so you see this this large scale sort of making or shaping of the public mind in a certain way. And you start to see how power works in, when it comes to media, when it comes to cinema, what people watch, what they can't watch, university campuses. You see universities behaving in a certain way, opening the door to right-wing thought. Big mistake in my view. These are the sort of things that we've seen happen in India. And so we've seen a narrowing of space, the kind of public space that exists for scholars and for anybody who asks questions and thinks critically. These are things we have seen in India. So yeah, I think if you look at India and you look at the last 10 years, you will find things that are unfolding in America, and you'll have seen that India has gone further along that path.
Thank you. And so, much of the book is devoted to chronicling the history of the RSS. So for the sake of the audience, could you tell us about the RSS? What is it? How are people recruited into it? What does it look like from the inside? And how is it related to the transformation that you're documenting in the book?
I probably should take a minute and tell them about the book. I think if they're listening over here. Look, the book began in 2016 or something. I was a reporter at Reuters, and India was changing very quickly. I think one of the hallmarks of countries like these, like India and America right now under certain regimes, is that you feel like news is endless. Like there's this fire hose of news, that you're subjected to every single day. And when you're a reporter and you're actually supposed to look at the news every day, it gets super, super overwhelming. And so I was looking at this, and India was changing. There were a few things happening. There were these technological changes happening. There were political changes happening all over the place, and I wanted to make sense of them, but I didn't really know how. So I quit my job, started looking at technology, and just spent time trying to understand why a certain kind of technology was coming into, was being adopted in India for an identification project. And along the way, I started seeing these little threads that linked to, religious movements, social movements, to extremists, and I've never done scholarly research. And so I just said, well, let me just go down this rabbit hole and that rabbit hole. And all I did for about 8 years was go down rabbit holes. And one of the places this thing took me was to indoctrination and extremism, religious extremism. And as I went down that thing, I came across this organization called the RSS, which pretty much, a lot of people know about. It is, the full form is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. And it's a 100-year-old body. It was started in 1925. And they were inspired by Mussolini's Balilla, which is this youth organization. And they decided that they were going to indoctrinate kids in nationalistic ideas. And they see themselves as an extremely patriotic body. That's from the inside. From the outside, when you look at intelligence reports, when you look at prime ministers who've been grappling with what this organization is, they all but say that it is a body that causes tremendous harm to the idea of a secular country. Now, this is a body that, we've had a prime minister come out of it. Prime Minister Narendra Modi was, or rather is, a member of the RSS. There are others, there are judges who are a part of it. It is a large, sprawling cultural organization. It runs the largest schooling system outside the government in India. And its students sort of tend to believe they tend to have these ideas about India and their place in it. They believe that India is for Hindus, for one. They believe in the idea of a glorious past. Many of them, many people that I've spoken to, believe that India really had, telephones and rockets 5,000 years ago, that we were first at that game. And I used to laugh at it, but then I started taking it seriously because I could see how many people were taking that seriously. The idea of a glorious nation. They tend to believe in some of the same things because it is a really tight organization, even though it is sprawling. It has these tight chains of communication where messages pass through so quickly, they're disseminated so quickly and so accurately that it is actually a wonder to see. I've watched it, I've spoken to people about it, and they're very, very organized, very disciplined. Every day, every morning across India, in playgrounds and open spaces, their members come together to do morning exercises, to salute the RSS flag, which I've witnessed. I hung out with them, and tell each other stories. And these can be like grown men, but there will always be a few, a smattering of children, really groggy-eyed. They're over there, but they're listening because these men talk about local concerns. They talk about how a Muslim man ran away with a Hindu woman, but they rescued the Hindu woman, or how there was violence in a particular area and they stopped it. And, they put their bodies on the line and things like that. And so it is a body which is extremely organized. It has its own set of myths. It is extremely effective, and its members are all over the place. And so that is the RSS. How are its people recruited? Well, I spoke to former members of the RSS, and what they had to tell me was they were children, they were indoctrinated, they believed, they beat up Muslim kids, all of that. And they told me when you're inside the organization, every single day or every week, there are stories about the greatness of Hindu kings and queens and warriors. And what you realize is, sitting on the outside, is this is an organization that is unparalleled at telling stories about the past and taking local legends. And India, look, is a vast country with, this massive oral tradition, the very well-known oral tradition. And every few kilometers, you have villages with their own deities, with their own, their own legends and things like that. And so what this organization does is, wherever it exists, it takes these old stories, adapts them, and makes them larger than life. It really, really does take hold of your imagination. And so I would say that the RSS is not just, and it came to me at some point, like, the RSS is not just a social political body, it's almost an idea. And I think it's survived for that long because at times where its members have had to go underground, for instance, right after the murder of Mahatma Gandhi, where one of its members assassinated Gandhi. They say he was a former member. But after that, during that time, they told each other stories. And after it was over, after they came out into the open, 40, 50 years later, they would talk about how traumatic that moment was for their members, how they had to go in hiding. And so everything turns into a story. I've heard historians look at what they do and just say, man, I wish I could tell stories like that. It really, I've spoken to historians who have said that. So, that they're doing something right, I guess. But yeah, they're problematic. They are problematic.
The book closes on what you call the identity project, this title, the alternative title that you just mentioned. So what is this project, and how is it related to the broader history that you tell in the book?
Yeah, I grew up in Dubai. I was, I remember this one time in 1992, and this is relevant, around 1992, December, my mother would take the phone and she would be on a call with her sister in Bombay. And whenever I came into the living room, she would shoo me away. She didn't want me to hear this conversation. And she would talk to her sister about how things were that day. Later on, she told me that it was December 1992, and there had been massive, massive violence in India. We're talking about hundreds of people dead because a mosque was demolished. It was a few centuries old. And the person who I would hold responsible for that demolition was a man named Advani, L.K. Advani. He's an Indian politician. He's from the BJP, Mr. Modi's party. And he was a member, or is a member, of the RSS. And what he did was he led this religious procession from Gujarat all the way to this town in the northeast called, or rather the north, called Ayodhya. And wherever that procession went, there was religious violence, there were riots. It just so happened, and it was purely political in nature. The reason they were walking to that mosque, the reason they were going to that mosque was because there was this idea that they were trying to spread, which was that it was the birthplace of the god Ram. And a mosque had been built on top of that. So it was portrayed as a provocation. And what he did was he basically took his people all the way up to the precipice of that mosque. And then they were all so riled up that they went forward, they demolished the mosque, and then there was violence all over. Now, as I was working on investigating this identification project in India, which began in 2009, and then quickly became the world's largest biometric identification project, I was talking to activists and lawyers and all kinds of other people, and they were telling me we just don't know why it exists. And they all had their conspiracies. They were talking about how the CIA was involved, how you had these French military companies, and they had documents, and these documents were pretty compelling. But why it existed in India was not something that I had an answer to. And I asked them, like, why does it exist? What is the need for it? This identification project was pitched to the Indian public as being great for welfare. It would streamline the delivery of welfare. India loses a tremendous amount of money every year to leakages in the system. And so this would cut out the leakages. Fine. Economists, meanwhile, were saying, well, the leakages are not as bad as you guys are making them out to be. And that's really not where the problem is. You're talking about transferring funds and having people put their thumbprint and authenticate who they are, and then they will receive money or food or whatever. But that's not the problem. The problem is when the person in charge of giving them their food gives it to them, they shave off a few kilos of their weekly rations. So that was not addressed. And so I said, well, the government's pushing this through. I was getting calls from the government saying, if you don't sign up for this identification number, your bank accounts will be frozen. You won't be able to make a phone call. I was like, what's going on over here? And so I kept asking people. I got lucky. I found a guy who, he goes fishing in the mountains now. He's retired. And he had actually designed this identification project 10 years before. And so I find him, I call him up, and about a day later, I'm at his house in Delhi, and we're surrounded by these stoves or something that he imports for clients in the mountains. And we get talking about this. And he says, well, this guy, Advani, the man who led the procession, he wanted to identify infiltrators, and it was about illegal immigrants. But when I asked him, what he meant by that. What do you think he meant by illegal immigrants? And everybody I spoke to, I asked them, because I know what it means, but I want to hear it from other people. What he really meant was Muslims. That was what people took it to mean. And so when I was looking at this, I said, well, here's a guy, he's from the RSS. He wants an identification system that people think will identify Muslims among them. What does this all mean? And so as I started looking at this identification project, this identity project, I could see that it was sprawling. It wasn't just about technology anymore. It was about identity itself. Who gets to be an Indian? Who is Indian? What happens to Muslims? What is the Muslim identity when it, in a Hindu country? All of these questions, they were starting to sort of connect to each other in a way that I was extremely excited about, because I hadn't seen these connections made before. That's why it took a really long time to do this book. I think it was just this massive information from here and there, and just trying to put it all together.
Great. So one of the parts of the book that I liked the most was your encounter with the economist Jean Dreze, who you call the most reasonable person that you met in months. So could you just tell us a bit about your meeting with him?
Yeah. When I said he's the most reasonable part of, one of the most reasonable people I've met in India in a long time, I think when you're in India, you're constantly, you're aware of how compliant people are. When the government says something, they stand up and say, yes, well, the government must be right. Or it doesn't matter. If the government says so, it must happen. I found Jean Dreze so refreshing. He's, a barefoot economist. He goes out into the countryside. He's meeting with people. I met him at a protest that he was helping organize. There were these villagers who were protesting direct benefit transfers based on this identification project, because money was not coming into their accounts. It was almost as if a parallel system of governance was emerging, and they didn't know who to talk to about it. Even people in governance didn't really, they felt like this parallel system of government, which was technocratic in nature, they didn't really know who to talk to about it when it malfunctioned. And so these people were protesting, and we walked for a few hours, and Jean Dreze kept walking up and down this line, talking to people and just kind of cheering them on and all of that. And I found him extraordinary, not just reasonable, but I think I found him extraordinary because this is a man who is obviously brilliant. He's training all these young economists and researchers and showing them how to go out into the countryside and talk to people. And he's able to make sense of the power and politics of technology. And when we were talking, it's, he's pretty shy. He doesn't like to talk about himself very much. But he left me for a little while, and there was this Bertrand Russell book on his desk. And I was reading the passages he underlined, and I just thought, my man, as I was reading that, it's just like, when you meet a kindred spirit. And I think, he's opposed to certain technology, not because he's a Luddite, but because he's asking the right questions. He's saying, why are we doing this in the first place? Why is the thing happening? He's going back to basics. And I love that about him and a lot of other economists and activists who are doing this work. They're asking the questions that people should be asking, but really aren't. I'm quite fond of him, and I'm not alone in this. I mean, when I've had conversations with lots of people about him, there's this little smile on their faces, and like, yeah, he's cool. So he's quite an extraordinary guy.
Let me ask you one more question before we turn to the audience questions. So As we've discussed today, this is a book about the new India, but more generally, it's a book about how the past is related to the present. And the book covers a vast territory. So how were you able to synthesize all of this material? I mean, how did you determine the form the book would take? And could you just tell us a little bit about your process as you were writing?
Thanks. Really, I think for a few years I was looking everywhere. For about 3 years, I was interviewing people. 3 or 4 years, I had done hundreds of interviews, and it was essentially a book about technology in India, about the technological identification project. And I think a couple of years before I came to the Radcliffe was when I met this man who told me about Advani and about this identification project that he had designed earlier. I had all of this information. I didn't really know what to do with it. There were also riots going on in India at that time. I think around 2020, we had these protests and then pogroms related to a new citizenship law. And I made it a point I couldn't go there at that time because COVID, but I went there the following year and I interviewed dozens of people, victims, survivors, people who had played a part in the violence. And I talked to them, and I really didn't know where this book was going, but I was just going by my gut, saying somehow this is all connected in some way. And I couldn't tell you how. I didn't even know how to describe the book. People just said, "What's your book in one line?" And I did not have a line for them. And so I just kept doing the work. I came over to the Radcliffe, where I think I just spent 9 months in the archives. And thanks to you, you introduced me to the libraries. And I think I started to see that many of like a lot of the violence that I was seeing in India right now, I could see echoes of it in the past, especially during partition. And so then there was a question that I had, which is, well, what was Nehru doing at this time during partition when he saw this violence? And I had other historians say, why didn't you check this tranche of documents? And so when I went to that tranche of documents, which was intelligence reports, they showed me that here is an organization that is extremely adept at violence and at hiding itself. And Nehru is going completely bonkers. He just does not know how to deal with these people. And I did not know any of this. I'm sure historians did and well-read people did, but I was able to then make connections between riots happening right now because I was looking at them independently, riots in the past because I was looking at the archives, and I could see how cells of young men were working with each other. And then, of course, these are not very, I wouldn't call them very smart men because they leave traces of themselves online. So they will have videos, and you will find a group of them with a particular pin code. They've got YouTube videos up. And when you look at them, these are men who have, who have sort of committed acts of extreme violence. And so as I had all of this information that was coming together, and I think after the Radcliffe, I sat down with hundreds of pages, lots of bits of writing, and then it was just a matter of structuring things. I wanted, as I was writing this, I didn't want to have, I didn't want to have the usual sort of chronological nonfiction book. I wanted it to be a bit of an experience where I'm in the present, a character asks a question, I take you into the past, and then I give you the background to everything. And then I wanted it to go back and forth, back and forth. I think it worked well for me because it wasn't planned. It was just me going by my gut and saying, this feels right now. And so it engaged me as a storyteller. That's how I went about it. It took a long, long time to put together.
Great. Okay. Here is the first question from the audience. I'm just going to read this. The abandonment of secular universal values and the rise of hate mongering in India and the US is scary, awful, and unacceptable. Still, do you wonder whether the secular project only resonated for an educated elite, but failed to address the deeper needs of the vast majorities of people and their sense of belonging, pride, and dignity?
I think secularism is important. I think the ideals it espouses are important, and I'll tell you why. Yes, I don't think it served people as well as it could have. But if you think about India, it's a pretty young nation. It I think it's still finding itself. I think it's still discovering itself. And the reason people go for secularism, and I don't think it's people saying secularism has not worked for us. I think it's something else that's not worked for them. I think it's the economy that hasn't worked for them. I think opportunities haven't reached them, which in fact allowed organizations like the RSS to reach out and offer services that the government could not. And that was how it grew in influence and made its way into neighborhoods where people probably would have once said, no, not really interested in this. It's important today. I think if you think about where we are right now, there are people who would argue that no, we're not a secular nation anymore. We're not. And we're seeing the effects of it. We're seeing the cops behave a certain way. We're seeing, stand-up comedians who, I don't know, make fun of a politician. The venue that they do it at is then sort of subject to a demolition by a mob while the police just stand by watching it all happen. You're seeing all of this happen. I think it's important to have secularism because it really gave us a certain rooting in something. It told us that you had to look for something bigger than yourself. What we have at the moment is disturbing because it really limits your field of view. If I'm making sense, I don't know if I'm making sense. It's just that there's a general narrowing that I see around me, and I'm not sure this has worked out very well. In fact, I would argue that this is not working out for anybody, whatever this is right now that we're living through. You've got corporations that really don't know what India's official numbers are. You don't know what your GDP really is. I think at some level, you have a lack of information, a lack of data all around. We are a data poor country at this point in time. You have a lot that's gone missing. And it's happened gradually over a period of time. It's been taken away from you. And so I would say, if anything, I mean, it's just become poorer in a certain way.
There are, the Q&A is full of praise for the book, I should say, which is wonderful to see. There are a few people who are wanting to hear a little bit more about the account of the rise of this identification card that you're discussing, and whether there might be alternative reasons for its rise. One audience member mentions its connections, its inspiration from the U.S. Social Security card. So, what would you say to these objections and how they relate to the account that you give in the book?
It has nothing to do with the U.S. Social Security card. I mean, yes, people said, oh, hey, India should have an identification number because the United States has an identification number. Okay, fine, let's have an identification number. What happens after that? What happens to privacy? The makers of this card said, the makers of this identification project said, oh, well, yeah, we'll come up with the privacy laws later. The government should do it. It hasn't happened in the way that you think. Your data is all over the place. You've been asking for privacy laws. Do you have meaningful privacy laws? Do you have meaningful consent? I'm not sure this stuff means anything right now in India. Did people require identification? Absolutely they did. Do I see the benefits of it? I absolutely do. I, in fact, think that Aadhaar could be pretty interesting if there is a limit on how data is used, if there are limitations on how data is used. But you're not getting those reassurances. And who are you getting reassurances from? How does the law work in India? It's almost as if you had this technocratic project which said, oh, because the United States is doing it, if India does it, we'll be modern. All right, look at the framework in which that thing exists. It exists in a state. I mean, come on. It's like, how does the law work in India? How does the justice system work in India? That should tell you what you're really dealing with. So anything you do, any technology that you have in this country is going to be subject to these laws and our practices and our way of sort of dealing with problems. And so it is a uniquely Indian problem. You need to have something that works for you, that protects you, doesn't give more power to the state. And I think, I think if I have a criticism, it is just that people refuse to engage with the idea that the state can become more dangerous, that the state can actively harm you and not have your best interests at heart. I think I saw that with the Identification Project. I certainly saw that with the makers of the Identification Project. These were people who refused to engage with how things can be misused, how they could go wrong. And I know this for a fact because I've got recordings which were shared with me by people who attended some of these closed door meetings. And so, I think we're not looking at power and how it operates enough in India. I think it's really, really important. It's something that we've really shied away from in many different ways, whether in politics, in sport, in you name it, basically. And to me, this Identification Project is an extension of how power works in India. Frankly, it's unacceptable at the moment.
I'm going to read you, it's more of a statement, but I'd like for you to react to it. Here's what one audience member writes. I grew up with and fully share the same values. I have had similar experiences as you describe on my many visits to India. I enjoyed your book and share the same concerns. I am, however, much more hopeful. The essence of India is its rich diversity. There is a fairly liberal, independent judiciary and a well-educated liberal middle class. How do you react to this?
I share your optimism. I don't know if we have a fairly liberal middle class. I don't know if we have a liberal judiciary. Maybe a few people here and there. My sense of optimism comes from the fact that, and I think this is people looked at the book and said, oh my God, it covers riots and it covers all the other dark stuff, indoctrination and this and that. But the people I spoke to were like beacons in the darkness. They were the John Drezes of the world who really wanted to improve things. The Usha Ramanathans, the legal scholar who put together the legal challenge to this Identification Project. The Nisar Ahmeds who lost their houses or who lost their house and everything they owned to violence, to mindless violence, and then they decide, despite everything, to go to court day after day after day after day and subject themselves to the Indian judicial system. I think for me, that's where hope lies. We're not articulating it yet, but I think what we're seeing from these people, and I think what I'd like people to take away, forget what I'd like people to take away. What I really take away from these people is that to change things, we're not going to be relying on whether we're liberal or not. It's about, are you going to stand up and are you going to get involved in whatever capacity you can? And I think in the readings that I've been doing, the response that I've been getting mostly from students, either in senior school or in college or just out of college, that has actually been really revealing. They've been super optimistic. They've really responded to the book, and they have, it's telling them something about the country that they didn't grow up with. This is a new kind of story for them, and in my conversations with them, they've all sort of said that they've got to get involved in one way or another. Not all of them, but a fair number of them have said that they'd like to get involved in one way or another. I think that's where hope lies. Just people not leaving it to somebody else, but just standing up and saying, I'll do it.
Let me close with two related questions. First, this comes from the audience. You have a prescient and alarming forecast of the similarities between the two largest putative democracies. What are your thoughts on solutions? What should citizens do? What is the role for intellectuals, media? And similarly, thanks for an important and well-researched book. Do you see a path back to secularism in a post-Modi India? Hate has been built over decades, but how long does it take to dismantle?
The first one is about solutions. I'm not very good at solutions. I don't know. I report, I write what I see, and then I think it's the same everywhere. Like, don't take what you have for granted. Don't open the door. Don't think you're being, there's something about these ideologies that does not tolerate your existence. That's the kindest way I can put it. That's the most straightforward way I can put it. They just do not like you. They do not like what you stand for. And some of them might say things like, well, it is good to have a diversity of voices, but really what ends up happening is your life becomes very difficult. And I know this because I look around me. Anybody I know who's asking a question is out of a job. And I saw this happen, I think, over the last couple of years with the United States. At various universities, people raising questions, they were threatened and whatnot, and it felt so familiar. We've seen our own version of this on campus in India. So I think don't take it for granted, because this could get a lot worse. It really could get a lot worse. And by that, I mean, what will you come back when, if, say, for example, even if today, if you manage to freeze it and you were to come back from this moment, what would you get? Would it be the same country? Probably not the same country. You've got a lot to deal with. You've got people there are people occupying positions where they can do a lot of damage in the next few years. So I think really you've got to, and here's the thing, you really have to think about this as a long-term project, because your opponents see this as a 100-year project. They see this as something that is going to take a very, very long time. That became clear to me when I read Dark Money, the book about Koch brothers, is that it? Anyway, Koch brothers. So, I think that became clear to me then. It became clear to me in the context of India, that these are long-term projects, and you just have to think, this is not going to happen in my lifetime, but maybe I can sort of get the ball rolling and things will improve over a period of time. As far as India goes, I'm not sure if we're going to return to the same kind of secularism. I'm an optimist, and I think it'll actually be something better. I think that Mr. Modi's election was actually, and lately I've come to think about it, and this has a lot to do with Zohran Mamdani, actually. I just got thinking about it. Maybe what we're seeing right now is people articulating this desire for a better life, for themselves, for something better. And so what you've tried now is the alternative, which is the right-wing vision of the world. I think in time, if India is able to recover its electoral process and get it working again properly, if it's able to get its justice system back, I do think that we might end up with something that's more representative.
Great. Well, this concludes our program today. I want to thank Rahul for his reading and fascinating conversation, and our audience for the terrific questions. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information about upcoming Radcliffe programs, including 3 more virtual summer book talks with other Radcliffe authors, Iris Bonet, Allegra Goodman, and Geraldine Brooks this summer, And to see videos of past events, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and take care.